some of the many problems associated with the Gilded Age: child labor, working conditions, life in the inner city tenements, the unlimited power of the trust, the monopolies, corrupt business practices of robber barons. These were all problems of the turn of the 20th century Gilded Age. In response, there was a third-party political movement called the Progressive Movement. Again, this was a third-party political movement that developed as a response to the excesses of the Gilded Age. It also emphasized the beneficial role that government could play in reforming the problems caused by industrialization. This is note opposite of what we had talked about before, being laissez-faire policy. Government did not regulate business practices. Thereby, business practices became unregulated and more corrupt. So the Progressive Party wanted to provide a more hands-on role for government to reform the problems caused by the Gilded Age. With an emphasis on progress, hence progressive movement, many progressive reformers were middle and upper class people who believed it was their religious duty to serve those less fortunate, and they believed that people and government could be a positive influence on society's development. There were three goals of the progressive movement. One, they wanted to return government controlled by the people, take it out of the hands of the fat cats, of the monopolist, of the trust, and out of the way of the political bosses that controlled the cities. They wanted to guarantee economic opportunity through government regulation. There were new laws passed that were antitrust, anti-monopoly laws. The first one was the Sherman Antitrust Act, which prevented any business structure that restrained trade, such as monopolistic practices of Standard Oil. The Sherman Antitrust Act could be used as a legal tool to bust up monopolies. The Clayton Antitrust Act expanded the Sherman Antitrust Act by outlawing price fixing, such as was done in pooling, and it exempted unions from the Sherman Antitrust Act, meaning that before, unions under the Sherman Antitrust Act, when they went on strike, would be viewed as restraining trade because they weren't working. But now the Clayton Antitrust Act strictly used the term of business trust, not the workers, as a restraint of trade in their practices. Thirdly, they wanted to eliminate social injustices. They were diverse in these reforms. First, they wanted to outlaw child labor. This was first achieved in the Keating-Owens Act. Children who worked in the coal mines, for example, would have to be of a certain age before they worked in the mines. Dangerous working conditions. The effects of alcohol in families. You see in this poster, keep him pure. Women in particular found that alcohol abuse led to the destruction of the American family. Therefore, the 18th Amendment, which was the Prohibition Amendment, which outlawed the sale and distribution of alcohol, was part of the Progressive Reform movement. They also geared towards environmental effects of industrialization, like pollution, and fairness in the elections. We'll talk more about corrupt election practices that were made more fair because of the progressive movement. The key to exposing these problems to society was accomplished by journalists who were called muckrakers with their association with the progressive movement. They were journalists who helped expose the filth. They were down in the muck and the corruption of big business, and to make reform a more urgent public issue. Many of these articles by muckrakers were published in the McClure magazine for all to read. So here you see the story of Rockefeller, read all about it, by Ida Tarbell. Some of the muckrakers included Jacob Riis. He wrote a book, How the Other Half Lives, in which he exposed life in the inner city tenements, the overcrowded conditions, the plight of the poor, the plight of the children in particular, and the need for change. Louis Hine, here he is, was a photographer for the National Child Labor Committee trying to expose how young children were working in very adult jobs. Here's a kid who's working in the oyster business. Here are some newsies, boys smoking cigarettes on the side of the street in New York City while selling papers. Children being deprived of a life of childhood and being forced into adult jobs. So the need to reform child labor and to end the practice. Ida Tarbell, as we've seen before, was the primary critic of Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company. A lot of the political cartoons of monopolists go over and go after John D. Rockefeller's trust, a monopolistic type arrangement. Ida Wells, we haven't talked about before. Ida Wells is an African American woman who urged the federal government to do more to provide anti-lynching laws. We talked about the racial violence of the South escalating in the post-Reconstruction era once the white South had redeemed power. The federal government had not really played an active role since the end of Reconstruction, and so the white South had started lynching black men in particular who were violating the segregation laws of the period. So Ida Wells believed that the federal government should make more laws to prevent those types of racial violent acts. Mostly the progressive movement ignored racial violence in the South. Most of it was geared toward the cities and working conditions, elections, politics. This one was more of a social issue geared towards the South. So she's kind of a unique progressive reformer. Upton Sinclair is pretty famous. He's the one who wrote the book The Jungle, in which he exposed the horrific and very unsanitary conditions in the meatpacking industry. The fact that animals going to slaughter were unhealthy with tumors and such, and going into American food supply, that the food itself was dragged on unclean floors, that there were rats and pesticides and things in American food sources in their meat. So this went after America's stomach as a need for change. In terms of accomplishments of local government, they address a lot of the problems of corrupt political bosses that would gain favor and power over a city through their money. The commission returned government back to people by appointing a group of citizens to run the city. A great example of this is after a hurricane destroyed Galveston, Texas, and the citizens formed a commission and decided that they would build a seawall. So they raised money as a commission to protect their city from future damage caused by hurricanes. That still exists today. We also have the council manager system to deal with local government. This is the way the city of Salem works. You've got an elected city council, here's your mayor, Foley, and a nonpartisan, non-party affiliated professional manager who is responsible to manage city affairs. So it kind of divorces politics from the management of the city's money. So it cleans up business. It's a much more fair, progressive form of government than what we had seen under the Gilded Age, where it was controlled by big money and the fat cats and corrupt politicians. Under state government, we have 3 items that you need to remember. It's associated with reforms. One is the initiative. Again, with the goal of returning government to the people. This was a way people could propose law. You could initiate a need for change, get people to sign a petition that something needed to change in your community or in your state. A referendum is a vote by the people on a proposed change. So you go from an initiative to a referendum on the ballot box. Should we have this change that was proposed? And then as far as elections go in state government, you know, if there are corrupt politicians that need to be out of office, then there can be a recall issued. And so it's kind of an election redo. It's a vote to remove politicians that have fallen into corrupt practices. So these are all ways to return government more to the people and less to the corruption of the Gilded Age. And then finally in elections, in order to return government closer to the people and allow more people to participate in elections, we have the primary system, in which you have a number of candidates for political office that are selected by the people for nomination to an office. So this is a picture showing the latest Republican primary. You have a whole slew of Republican candidates, and then ultimately the Republican Party selected Mitt Romney to run as the Republican candidate in the last presidential election. So the process begins much earlier, where the people can become involved in the elected process. Before, it was the political bosses, the fat cats, the inside circles that made those decisions. The 17th Amendment to the Constitution also returned government closer to the people by providing for the direct election of U.S. senators. This means that the people themselves directly elect U.S. senators before they were chosen by politicians in the state, by the state legislature. So it was much more prone to political intrigue and corruption. This one returns it directly to the people. So remember the 17th Amendment. And then the 19th Amendment, as women get involved in the anti-child labor campaign and want a more of a voice in politics in the progressive movement, they demanded the vote. So women's suffrage, the right of women to vote, becomes a part of the progressive era accomplishments. Women need the ability to vote in order to make changes in society. And that is accomplished by the time you get to the World War I era. So we'll talk about their role also in World War I. And then finally, the secret ballot. Before, ballots were not secret. They were open ballots that you could tell who people were voting for. So as a result of the progressive movement, we have secret ballots where it preserves the independency of the vote, the secrecy. You cannot be coerced by your employer or coerced by friends or family into voting a certain way, because it's all done secretly. So all of these methods are associated with the progressive era accomplishments. So please review these slides. This is all associated with the material you need to know about the progressive movement. We'll be looking later at the accomplishments of individual presidents associated with the progressive movement.